They were born at the exact moment the sun vanished behind the moon. The villagers, hardened by centuries of survival, froze as the skies dimmed in unnatural silence. Chickens stopped clucking. Dogs lowered their heads. The winds, usually playful with the mountain trees, refused to move. It wasn't just any eclipse, it was total, long, and blood-tinged. The elders, who kept records carved into rock and passed stories through smoke and ash, claimed they had seen such an event only once before, and that time it had been followed by a famine that wiped out half their ancestors. So when the screams of a mother in labor echoed through the valley during that same red eclipse, there was no celebration. There was no dancing. No ritual fire. Only fear. The woman, young and unmarried, was known to most in the village not by name but by what people whispered behind her back, La Marqueta, the marked one. She had no family, no husband, no story that people believed. Some said she'd emerged from the desert 4 years earlier, barefoot and pregnant, though no child had ever followed. Others claimed she never spoke a word until the night she cried out in labor. The hut she lived in stood just outside the cornfields, marked with signs no one could read, smeared in ash and plant dyes. People avoided her. She avoided people. But on that night, no one could ignore what was happening. 2 healers, both reluctant and trembling, were pushed forward by the crowd gathering outside her hut. The eclipse cast long, unnatural shadows. The sky was red, but not with sunset. It was darker than twilight, though no stars showed. As the women entered her home, their chants weak and shaky, they found her on the floor, knees in blood, eyes wild. She wasn't screaming like a woman in pain. She was singing, or chanting, rhythmic, guttural, ancient sounds that neither healer recognized. The air smelled of copper and burned herbs. The fire inside the hut hadn't been lit, yet the walls pulsed with heat. The birth was unlike anything they'd seen. No one helped her. She needed no hands to guide her through the agony. Within minutes, 2 infants lay at her feet, slick with blood and perfectly still. No crying. No gasping. No whimper. Just open eyes staring directly upward, unmoving, unblinking. One healer dropped her pouch and ran. The other, too afraid to scream, backed into the corner. But the mother didn't look afraid. She looked proud. Triumphant. She raised one baby in each arm, whispering words no one could translate, as if declaring them to something above. News spread quickly. The twins were identical in every possible way, same birthmarks, same hairline, same teeth, same pitch of voice when they finally spoke. But more than that, they were off. Babies cry. They didn't. Babies soil cloth. These didn't. Babies grow. These stayed the same weight, the same size, for far longer than was natural. At first, villagers claimed the mother had made a pact, perhaps with one of the old gods who lingered in caves and thunder. Perhaps she had called something down during the eclipse and traded part of her soul. Perhaps these weren't babies at all. The elders held a secret meeting, carved bones and burned feathers, trying to determine if this birth signaled fortune or doom. Some argued that twin births under an eclipse were a prophecy, a rare symbol of the return of balance, the sun and moon in alignment, light and shadow sharing the sky. Others believed the twins were not human at all. That they were born from a rift in the sky, messengers of something the village could not understand. They had no fathers. No history. Just silence and symmetry. Within weeks, the mother vanished. Her hut, once filled with symbols and strange herbs, stood cold. No footprints led away from it, yet she was gone. The twins remained. A family from the edge of the village, childless and cursed with barren years, were told to raise them under strict observation. No outside visitors. No questions. No outside tongues to confuse them. The family agreed, but reluctantly. They were paid not in coin but in secrets, rituals once forbidden, access to the temple stones locked for generations. In exchange, they raised the boys. By the time they were 5, the village had stopped asking questions, but they never stopped watching. The twins moved with uncanny unity, spoke when spoken to but never laughed, never wept, never played like the other children. They sat for hours staring at water or the fire pit. Animals refused to go near them. Elders who once believed in omens now avoided them. When the first scientist came decades later, asking about strange stories in remote places, the villagers denied everything. But they couldn't deny the birth. They all remembered the eclipse. They remembered the red sky. They remembered the day time stood still. They didn't speak for the first 3 years, but no one was worried. Some children take time, the adoptive parents were told. Boys often speak later than girls. But when the twins did finally utter their first words, it wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a babyish stumble into language, it was full sentences, complex and deliberate, but in a tongue no one could place. Not Spanish. Not Nahuatl. Not any regional dialect from the surrounding valleys. The words came in unison, synchronized perfectly, as though they shared one mind split between 2 bodies. They would look at one another before speaking, a slight nod exchanged, and then the sounds would flow. Rhythmic. Measured. Ancient. Terrifying. The villagers who overheard their early conversations didn't know whether to call a priest or a linguist. One elderly man, who had spent decades documenting rare regional languages, listened to them for 2 hours from behind a thin curtain and then fled the village before sunset. He left all his notes behind. His final recorded sentence, scribbled in haste, "They are speaking a language that remembers the world before we were born." That same night, his hut was found completely emptied. No papers. No artifacts. Just an overturned chair and a feather soaked in something dark. Attempts to record the twins' speech failed repeatedly. Wax cylinders cracked, cassette tapes warped, digital files erased themselves or returned garbled, filled with static and backwards laughter. A university team brought high-end equipment to capture and analyze the language, but every time the twins began to speak, the machines either stopped functioning or played back only silence. Yet the human ear could hear it clearly, crystal clear, in fact, as if the sounds bypassed the ears and landed directly in the mind. People described it as a voice not heard, but remembered. The words came with gestures too, hand movements and facial tics that shifted with every sentence. It wasn't just a language, it was a system, something deeply structured and ritualized. When separated, the twins refused to speak at all. They would shut down completely, eyes fixed ahead, lips motionless. Only when reunited would they resume their verbal exchange, picking up mid-thought as if no time had passed. Some believed the language wasn't human. Others insisted it was a forgotten dialect, one that predated the conquest, the pyramids, even the oldest cave paintings found in the region. A missionary priest, fluent in Latin and several Mesoamerican tongues, claimed he recognized fragments in the twins' speech, words that sounded eerily close to ancient Mayan prayers for rain, Aztec chants for rebirth, and even Olmec astronomical codes. But when he tried to mimic the sounds back to the twins, they fell completely silent and refused to look at him. He took it as offense, but the villagers saw it differently. The twins weren't offended, they were warning him. He left 3 days later, pale and gaunt, muttering that some tongues were not meant for the living. The most unsettling part wasn't the language itself, but how it affected others. People reported dreams after hearing the twins speak, long, vivid dreams filled with geometry, lightless cities, and voices speaking backwards through water. One woman woke up with symbols carved into the wooden walls of her home, though she had no memory of how they got there. A child who spent one afternoon playing near the twins stopped speaking entirely and never recovered. She later drew spirals for hours, filling pages with loops and arcs that closely matched the glyphs found on untranslatable stele deep in the Yucatan. As they grew older, the twins began writing, first in dirt, then on clay, eventually on paper. Their script resembled no known system. It flowed from right to left, sometimes in circles, sometimes as intersecting lines. When shown their writings, a visiting cryptographer suggested it resembled mathematical language more than traditional script, possibly encoding concepts rather than individual words. But even that theory fell apart when one of the twins erased a full page with a single breath, leaving the paper blank as though nothing had ever touched it. The adoptive family, by now weary of visitors and questions, set firm boundaries. No photographs. No recordings. No interviews. They claimed the twins were gifted but private. But stories still leaked. A traveling poet swore that when he heard the twins speaking near a river, he wept uncontrollably for hours, even though he didn't understand a word. A soldier, posted nearby during a rural census, claimed the boys spoke to him in his dead grandmother's voice, recounting childhood secrets no one else could have known. Despite all this, no one could teach them another language. Spanish, English, Nahuatl, none of it stayed. They could mimic the words briefly but always returned to their own speech, as if all other tongues were too crude, too limited, or too new for them. Attempts to educate them failed. They weren't unteachable. They were simply uninterested in learning anything the modern world had to offer. Their knowledge, their vocabulary, whatever lived inside that unearthly language of theirs, seemed far older and infinitely more complex. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, something wasn't normal, came from the village doctor, who kept rough growth charts on paper scraps tacked to his hut wall. At age 5, the twins weighed the same as they had at age 3. At age 7, their height hadn't changed. Their hair didn't grow. Their teeth remained perfectly white, never yellowing, never shifting, never falling out like other children's. They didn't bruise. They didn't scar. One of them was once scratched by a jagged rock near the river, a deep wound across the forearm, and yet by the time the adoptive mother had run to find water and cloth, the skin had already healed. No mark remained. The other twin had a nosebleed once, just once, but the blood wasn't red. It was a pale coppery brown, and it vanished into the dirt within seconds, leaving no trace behind. At first, people whispered that the boys were simply lucky, genetically gifted, perhaps. But by age 10, when their classmates had grown gangly and awkward, the twins still looked like children of 6 or 7. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors noticed it. And eventually, strangers did too. Photos taken over a span of 6 years showed no visual change in their faces. No facial structure shifting with puberty. No stretching limbs. No thickening voices. Their speech remained unchanged, still that strange, rhythmic tongue, but their bodies didn't betray time's passing. They looked like living statues of themselves. The adoptive parents stopped celebrating birthdays. There was no point in pretending anymore. Cakes felt absurd. Clothes still fit. The boys never asked for presents. They didn't even seem aware of time the way others were. They didn't mark seasons or remember holidays. They didn't measure their lives in years or ages, only in phases of the moon, or the blooming of a certain cactus flower that only bloomed once every spring. When asked how old they were, they never gave a number. They would answer instead with something cryptic, "We are between sunfalls," or "We are past the 5th blue night." Medical professionals became involved reluctantly. The villagers had no love for outsiders meddling in what they viewed as sacred or dangerous. But eventually, curiosity grew stronger than fear. A small team of researchers from the capital came posing as census workers. They measured bone density, scanned for abnormalities, and drew blood, though not without difficulty. The boys had to be coaxed into the room, and every machine brought near them would glitch or reset. The readings, when they could be obtained, were inconclusive. Their bones were dense, almost unnaturally so, yet showed no signs of aging or development. Their teeth were like enamel sculptures, flawless, unblemished, and static. Their internal organs were normal in shape, but no one could say for sure whether they functioned in the usual way. One lab technician fainted when she saw the blood samples under a microscope. She said the cells weren't shaped right. That they didn't divide or behave as they should. When the samples were sent to another facility for verification, they never arrived. The transport vehicle crashed just outside the capital under clear skies and without explanation. Every sample was destroyed in the fire. The twins, unaffected, continued their quiet lives as if untouched by the disruption. Local children grew up and moved away. Generations passed. But the twins remained. By the time some of their classmates had children of their own, the twins still looked like boys. The elders began to call them Los Hijos Silenciosos, the Silent Sons. They were seen less and less, appearing only during eclipses, full moons, or the first rains of the season. A photograph taken during a wedding showed them standing in the background, identical to how they appeared 15 years prior. The picture was sent to a tabloid, but the story was pulled before publication. An old woman who had lived beside the twins for decades insisted they hadn't aged a single day since she first saw them. She said they moved like shadows, there, and then not. When her son tried to move her to the city, she refused, saying she wanted to stay near them. They know the rhythm of the earth, she told him. They remember when the stars sang. I feel safe with them nearby. A few tried to test them more directly. One man offered to take them to a larger city for education and study, but the boys simply vanished for 3 days. When they returned, they bore fresh garments made of woven agave and turquoise thread, clothing not seen in centuries. Another man tried to clip a strand of one twin's hair to run DNA tests. The scissors rusted overnight, and by morning, the blade had snapped in two. He claimed he heard singing outside his house that night, melodies without words, echoing like wind through stone. The village that took in the twins was small, tucked between dry hills and cactus groves, a place forgotten by maps and bypassed by highways. It had one chapel, 2 schools, and no more than 60 houses, most of them passed down through generations. It was the kind of place where stories outlived people, where secrets were carried in bloodlines and fear was passed like heirlooms. So when the twins arrived, mute at first, then speaking a language no one recognized, then refusing to grow, people did not react with curiosity. They reacted with superstition. In the village, difference was never neutral. It was either divine or dangerous. And often, it was both. The family chosen to raise the twins did not volunteer. They were chosen by the village council in a quiet meeting after the mother vanished. The couple was barren, deeply religious, and burdened by guilt from a tragedy they never discussed. They accepted the twins with bowed heads and trembling hands, as if taking in a punishment they had long expected. Their home sat on the edge of the village, near a grove of mesquite trees where animals often avoided. After the twins moved in, the grove grew darker. The trees bent slightly inward, as though leaning to listen. There were rules, spoken and unspoken. The family was told never to bring the twins into the chapel. Never to let them play with the other children unsupervised. Never to allow them near mirrors after dusk. A wooden cross was nailed to their front door, but it was upside down, and no one ever explained why. The rules weren't questioned. They were observed with the solemn obedience of people who had seen strange things before and knew better than to challenge them. The other villagers watched from a distance. They left food at the family's gate, offered clothes, never made eye contact with the boys. On certain days, days of unusual wind or birdsong, no one went near the house. Doors were bolted, incense was burned, and prayers were whispered to saints not found in any Bible. The twins were treated not with hostility, but with reverence touched by fear. Some elders claimed they were not children at all, but old spirits reborn. Others said they were a test. Others still believed they were the result of some ancient sin, come back to collect a debt owed by the land. Despite their isolation, the twins were never harmed. They were fed, sheltered, educated by a tutor brought from another village who refused to sleep under the same roof. He taught them arithmetic, basic history, and letters, but they never took to it. They'd listen politely, then return to scribbling their own symbols in the dirt, scripts that moved like rivers, lines curling around themselves, repeating in patterns the tutor claimed gave him headaches when he stared too long. On feast days, the twins stayed home. On processions, they were locked inside. During eclipses, however, they were allowed to wander. Not because anyone encouraged it, but because no one could stop them. They would walk through the fields barefoot, whispering to plants, placing small objects, stones, feathers, dried fruit, in precise formations no one dared to disturb. Animals followed them in silence. Crows perched low on fences. Lizards watched from walls, unblinking. The family never called them by names. Not in public. Not even in private, according to the woman's journal found decades later in the lining of an old chest. She wrote that the twins responded only to a sound, a low, vibrating hum, impossible to spell, like the echo of wind through a conch shell. She said they never cried, never laughed, never touched each other. But when they slept, they always turned the same direction. And if one moved, the other mirrored it exactly. As the years passed, the village stopped speaking of the twins entirely. Their name was a taboo. Tourists who wandered in were steered away gently. No photographs were allowed. One man who tried to sketch them was found days later muttering in a language no one recognized, his drawings burned to ash. He left with a blank stare and a stitched mouth, never speaking again. Children were warned to stay away from the edge of the village. Stories became cautionary tales. Don't stray past the mesquite trees. Don't follow voices into the fields. Don't answer if you hear two people speaking in unison. A generation grew up never having seen the twins, only hearing fragments, the rustle of leaves, the flicker of movement beyond the cornrows, two silhouettes standing beneath the moonlight, always watching, never changing. The family aged. The twins did not. Eventually, the couple passed, buried in unmarked graves behind the house. The twins remained. Alone, silent, never seeking a new home, never speaking to mourners. Just waiting. The village didn't try to remove them. It had learned long ago that trying to interfere came with consequences. They were no longer children. They were no longer villagers. They were something else. Something the village had accepted, not with peace, but with quiet surrender. The first formal attempt to study the twins came in the summer of 1912, when a government health inspector, sent to check on remote settlements after reports of illness in nearby towns, took notice of two boys who seemed strangely unaffected by time. He was skeptical of the stories. Skeptical, too, of the villagers' nervous glances and vague answers. But when he saw the boys with his own eyes, identical, small, eerily composed, he sent a letter to Mexico City marked urgent. Within a month, a team of scientists, physicians, and an anthropologist arrived under the guise of a rural census effort. They brought wagons of equipment and notebooks thick with questions. They were ready to catalog anomalies. What they encountered instead was silence. The twins refused to cooperate. They did not speak a word of Spanish or any language the team recognized. They would only speak when facing each other, and even then, only in that strange, humming tongue. When separated, they sat in stillness, their expressions blank, their hands resting in mirrored positions on their knees. One physician attempted to measure their reflexes but stopped halfway through the examination. He claimed the boys' eyes had changed color mid-blink, like glass catching shifting light. Another researcher fainted when trying to examine their spines. He insisted the bones didn't feel like bone, but more like stone warmed from within. Blood samples were impossible to collect. Needles bent against their skin. Thermometers shattered when placed under their tongues. An assistant suggested it was a hoax, some elaborate local trick, but the others weren't so sure. The anthropologist, a man who had spent decades studying indigenous tribes, said the boys reminded him of old myths, twins born under rare skies, untouched by disease, carrying the weight of forgotten knowledge. He left the village before the week ended, citing sudden illness, though others said he simply refused to sleep near them after a single night of hearing their voices in dreams. The official report from the 1912 expedition was never made public. What little information survived came from a personal diary kept by a junior member of the team, a young botanist who had joined to study local plant life but found himself drawn into the strangeness surrounding the twins. His notes, hidden in the pages of a field journal discovered decades later in a library archive, describe waking up to find the twins standing outside his tent at dawn, their faces calm, their hands holding something that looked like blue corn but shimmered like crystal. He took it. The next morning, it was gone from his bag. He never spoke of them again after returning to the capital. He changed professions within the year. After 1912, the twins were left alone. Until 1948. This time, it was not curiosity that brought the outsiders, but war. The global conflict had left nations desperate for scientific breakthroughs, and rumors had surfaced about immortal children in the mountains of central Mexico. The new team came under military orders, posing as geological surveyors but armed with far more than compasses. They arrived in armored trucks, with crates of testing kits, tranquilizers, and restraints. They were prepared for resistance. They were not prepared for what they found. The twins were waiting. Not hiding. Not running. Waiting. What followed was never fully documented. The official record states that the mission was cut short due to unexpected environmental complications. But witnesses, those who dared speak in secret, told another story. Machines failed. Batteries drained within minutes. Steel equipment corroded overnight. One soldier reportedly vanished during an attempt to escort the twins to the transport vehicle. Another was found days later in the river, eyes wide, mouth filled with ash. The twins were never moved. They never resisted, but they never obeyed. They simply stood, silent and still, until the team gave up. The lead researcher, a woman who had previously studied rare genetic mutations, tried to make sense of what she had seen. She wrote a paper years later under a pseudonym, claiming to have encountered biological time anomalies in human form. The paper was rejected. She died under mysterious circumstances a few months later. Her notes were confiscated, never released. No government officials visited the village again. Since then, smaller, unofficial attempts have been made. Independent scholars. Occult researchers. Pseudoscientists. Even filmmakers. None returned with clear footage. None could stay more than a few days. One group from Europe, equipped with satellite uplinks and thermal drones, sent back only a single image, a grainy still of two figures standing side by side in the middle of a dried cornfield, eyes pointed directly at the camera despite being more than a mile away. The villagers, by then, had grown used to the rhythm of invasion and retreat. They warned the newcomers with the same words: they cannot be measured. They cannot be moved. They are not like us. No one listened. And yet each time, science left the same way it arrived, confused, incomplete, humbled. The mystery of the twins remained intact, as though it could only survive so long as it resisted explanation. The twins were never given official names. The villagers used only nicknames, passed in whispers or scratched into stone, and even those changed over time. To some, they were Los Hijos del Eclipse. To others, Los que no cambian. But in the years after the failed investigations, their names, whatever they once were deliberately erased from memory. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, quiet disappearance, like mist burning off in the morning sun. First, stories stopped being told in front of children. Then drawings were taken down from walls. Then, without ceremony, the twins were no longer mentioned at all. A generation came and went without ever seeing them. A few elders claimed the twins still lived in the village, that they had merely chosen a new form of hiding, one more complete. They said the boys had become part of the land itself, or the sky, or something in between. Others believed they had finally left, not walking or traveling but vanishing the same way they had appeared. Whatever the truth, their old home was boarded up, the windows nailed shut with crosses carved in reverse. The field behind it grew wild, and no one dared clear it. The village declared the land cursed, not with hate, but with respect. In the local schoolhouse, there had once been a blackboard sketch of the twins drawn in chalk by a visiting teacher. The sketch was erased, the board replaced, and the teacher dismissed. She had asked too many questions. Some of her students said she had spoken to the twins in dreams, that she'd woken up in the middle of class with symbols scrawled across her arms in ink no soap could remove. Her departure was swift. Her name was not spoken again. Like the twins, she was absorbed into silence. Religious leaders came and went, but none stayed long. One young priest tried to lead a revival, insisting that the village reclaim its past, confront its sins. He disappeared 2 weeks later. His rosary was found hanging from the mesquite tree near the twins' old home, but no other trace of him remained. Another priest, older and wiser, simply stated, "Some things are not for us to carry," and left before the next full moon. His sermons were not about salvation, but about endurance. He warned that forgetting was sometimes the only protection mortals had against ancient things that never died. Tourists occasionally passed through the area, usually in search of regional ruins or old colonial churches. They were directed elsewhere. Maps were altered. Guides were paid to change routes. No mention of twins, no local legends, nothing unusual. One travel writer who wandered off course returned pale and silent, her notebook filled with loops and spirals that no one could translate. She left without publishing anything. Her website, once filled with vibrant stories, was replaced with a single image, 2 stone figures beneath a moonless sky, their faces blurred as if by wind. Local officials denied everything. When approached by researchers or journalists, they laughed and shook their heads. Urban myths, they said. Village superstition. But in private, they locked certain drawers, hid certain papers, and avoided certain roads after dark. They knew better than to interfere. The twins had not just been forgotten. They had been buried, deliberately, carefully, with ritual. Not in graves, but in the collective memory of the town. But memory, like old roots, has a way of pushing back through soil. On certain nights, old women still place offerings at the edge of the fields, small bowls of maize, obsidian chips, a splash of pulque poured into the ground. They don't say who the offerings are for. They don't explain the lullabies they hum as they walk home. They just perform the motions passed down by mothers who never spoke of where they learned them. The village has no shrine to the twins, but it doesn't need one. The silence itself is sacred. Occasionally, new children claim to have seen the mirror boys standing near the cactus grove, watching from the fog. Parents hush them quickly. Dreams, they say. Imagination. The children forget. Or pretend to. Drawings disappear. Crayon sketches are burned. But sometimes, in the folds of their blankets or behind torn pages of schoolbooks, spirals reappear. In the village archives, hidden behind the chapel, there was once a ledger that mentioned the twins' birth. That page is gone. Torn cleanly. Not ripped, not aged, removed with precision. In its place is a single word written in deep ink, Cerrado. A linguist who tried to decode that word in context claimed it didn't mean closed in the conventional sense. It meant sealed. Not locked, but guarded. Not forgotten, but protected. As if what had been buried could still be awakened. As if the silence was not the absence of story, but the story itself. The twins were not erased. They were hidden. Not out of shame, but out of necessity. Not to dishonor them, but to keep the world safe from remembering what they truly were.